I'd like to welcome you to another of our Institute Encounters, which are a series of interviews that we conduct with guest speakers who come to Texas Tech under the auspices of the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. Today our guest is Professor Phil Gorski of Yale University, Professor of Sociology there. Professor Gorski writes about very interesting and timely topics. His most recent book, American Covenant, is an exploration of how Americans have understood themselves through their civic culture and the importance of citizenship, American citizenship, in our fraught modern times. And let's begin the interview by talking about those fraught modern times. I assume that you wrote this book in part because you were concerned about what was happening to America and its civic culture. So maybe you can tell a little bit about your motivation for writing the book.
Well, I think in part it's autobiographical. So, I was raised in a religious home and have spent most of my life in the most secular milieu in American society, which is, say, the academy. And so I've always kind of felt that tension between the religious and the secular in my own life. And certainly that is also one of the sources of tension in our civic life as well. And have always thought in a way that a lot of the voices that currently dominate our civic discussion are sort of exaggerated have exaggerated one-sided understandings of our history. Some that portray the United States as an Enlightenment democracy or a secular Enlightenment project, and others who portray it as a kind of a Christian nation. And the understanding that I've come to in my own reading and thinking about American history is that the proper understanding is to see our civic culture as having both religious and secular sources that have always been intertwined. So the hope is that if we could recover that middle way, that would provide some common ground, which folks who currently don't understand each other might at least, and don't really engage each other anymore, might engage each other again, even if they're not necessarily going to come to agreement about everything. At least we could restart our civic conversation. So that was really what I had in mind in writing the book.
So when you say it's kind of autobiographical, I guess the problem presented itself to you very forcefully, coming from a religious background, when you arrived, as you were saying, in the university, the most secular place in America, maybe even in many respects kind of more than secular, kind of anti-religious. What would you say about the way in which the Academy looks at religion and American religion?
I think the situation has probably gotten a little bit better than it was when I started graduate school 30 years ago, where it was something that people didn't even take seriously on an intellectual level. Forget about taking it seriously kind of on a philosophical level. I think there's a lot more intellectual attention to it, but I think it is still a source of irritation, I suppose, for a lot of people, and something that a lot of secular academics just kind of don't really get. I've certainly had more than one person come up to me after I've given talks like this and say, "Well, but you don't really believe this stuff, do you?" Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, but you seem like such a reasonable and rational person. So, the assumption immediately being that you couldn't possibly be a reasonable and rational person and have any kind of religious belief. So I think that, that sentiment is probably out there more often than it gets articulated. And, I take those articulations, the times where it's been said to me openly, as indicating, more underlying sentiment that a lot of people have. I mean, that said, a lot of people are relatively tolerant. I don't think it's, I think sometimes the situation looks worse to outsiders than it actually is.
I can recall, if you're a public figure, you have the misfortune of everything you're saying, even if you don't know it at the time nowadays, being recorded and quoted later. So my recollection is this was in 2008, when President Obama was recorded as characterizing those who sort of opposed him as bitter clingers, he put it, clinging to their guns and religion, a kind of notion that suggests that it's a kind of opiate for those who have otherwise failed in life, or at least have found themselves in some corner of society from which they can't escape. Is that a kind of attitude that is shared by a lot of your colleagues?
I think that is the general view, is that you're compensating for something.
So rather than a kind of positive way of kind of more realizing yourself as an individual in the universe, it's something you've fallen back on, a life preserver.
It's a sign of weakness or
negative view.
Yeah.
So in the academy today, a good deal of, well, let me step back and wonder whether that's true. Is there sufficient sociological attention to religion, would you say, or is this an understudied subject?
Again, I think I would say what I said before, which is when I remember when I was in graduate school and decided that this was going to become one of my central interests. A couple of faculty said, well, that's kind of a strategy. That's professional suicide.
Yeah.
That's self-marginalization. And I said, well, okay, but this is what I'm interested in, what I think I could say something significant about, so I'm just going to do it anyway. It turned out differently. I think people were forced to realize that religion was still a very important force in the world, for good and for evil, of course. So that's, I think there's more. You can always say, oh, well, I wish people would pay more attention. But people always say this. They always wish what they study got more attention than it does. So I think it gets actually a fair degree. I think the situation is more problematic in the other social sciences, political science, for example. Still very little attention to religion, comparatively speaking. Sociology is better in that regard. In economics, that's a whole other situation, of course.
Well, you've questioned some of the kind of narratives in the social sciences about the decline of religion, about what is often called secularization. You've questioned them in part, I think, because they're not sufficiently grounded in evidence, that they don't look at the right indicators, and I think to some extent you suggest that they overestimate, or if they don't overestimate, they kind of have a final verdict that they deliver on the future of religion, which can't really be substantiated. It does seem to me that Christianity, by various indicators, seems to be in a period of pretty dramatic decline in the Western world in general, and even more lately in America. What do you attribute that to, if that's correct?
Well, I have a somewhat different take than some people do about this. I don't see the decline of Christianity in Western Europe and more recently in the United States as the result of science or progress or enlightenment. I think the relationship between Christianity, science, enlightenment was much more symbiotic and complementary than a lot of people would like us to believe. I actually think it has more to do with politics, to be honest, and that I think the period of most dramatic secularization, that sort of launched Europe on the trajectory that it has been on since the mid-20th century, really was late 19th, early 20th century, when some of the Christian churches were state churches and got into too close an embrace with a certain kind of anti-liberal conservatism, and that this meant that people who didn't embrace that kind of anti-liberalism were progressive, or Republican, or democratic, or social democratic, felt that they had no place in the churches. Why did the United States escape that fate? The reason that the United States escaped that fate is, first of all, that it didn't have an established state church, which meant that there were, kind of just sort of a rainbow of different shades of theology and politics and ways of thinking about the relationship between them, and also that you couldn't really claim that there was a party that stood for religion. William Jennings Bryan, Democratic candidate, progressive, was also in some sense a social gospeler, for example. And that's, I think, what worries me about the current conjuncture in the United States is I think we may actually be repeating this European pattern, that there is a too close relationship that's developed between some leadership within the churches and political party around a certain set of issues. We'll see how this develops. I think one thing, I think one of the things that still remains different is the kind of voluntaristic and sectarian character of American Protestantism. And so I think what may well happen is that there are going to be new movements that are going to break off and emerge out of contemporary evangelicalism. You already see this happening, actually. A lot of the younger evangelicals whom I talk to, you already see this happening. So, and I think that part of what the opinion polls are picking up in recent years, you see this, there's been this rather dramatic drop-off of, for example, people who identify, of evangelicals, right, over the last 5 years. I don't think that really means that many people have stopped going to church or don't believe what they used to believe. It's just that they don't want that label anymore, because they feel that label is increasingly associated with a small group of leaders who seem to be much more interested in their connections to Washington and their connections with their parishioners.
Though people say in the United States that the mainstream churches also have picked up a kind of political social justice mission. Mm-hmm. Does that affect, you think that affects them in the same way?
I think that was certainly something that did play a role in the 70s. So I think there's pretty good historical and sociological evidence that clerical leadership in some of the liberal denominations during that period wound up at a place quite to the left of where a lot of the people in the pews were, and that this drove some of those people away from the church or into other movements or denominations. I mean, I saw that happen, people within my own wider extended family. So I feel both, kind of anecdotally, ethnographically, but also historically and sociologically pretty confident that did happen. I think it's probably less the case now, just because liberal churches are not nearly as central to kind of current social justice movements as they were in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. These are, Black Lives Matter is by and large a secular movement.
So do you think that political involvement has generally hurt religious feeling and observance in the Western world?
It's a sort of a Goldilocks problem. I think that that Christians and Jews can't detach themselves from political and social concerns. It's not an otherworldly, self-involved religious ethic. So you can't, you're supposed to be, as the saying goes, in the world but not of the world. And so that requires maintaining a certain kind of delicate tension. And I think, again, by and large, American Protestantism, American Christianity more broadly, has been fairly successful over the long arc of American history and maintaining that. I mean, this is one of the things that Tocqueville remarked on in Democracy in America, is really setting American democracy and American religion apart from religion democracy in Europe. That somehow managed to have this, maintain the right level of distance without completely becoming involved. So, but it's difficult. I think what allowed that, what made that possible, I think, was a sort of within the American Protestant tradition, was a sort of strong sense of kind of fallenness and brokenness and introspection and humility. I think this is one of the things that is perhaps a little bit too much missing from some contemporary social justice movements, that that observers often remark on the kind of this kind of self-righteous character of a lot of these movements. People so so certain that they're in sole possession of the truth, so unwilling really even to dialogue with the other side. And I think that's something that's lost in secular versions of social justice movement. So the contrast for me would be, if you think about the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and others, part of their practice before they engaged in nonviolent resistance was that they would meet and actually reflect very actively about their own limitation and defects, and really kind of criticize themselves before they went out and confronted other people about their sort of failings. And I think that really gave that movement a kind of moral authority that many people just don't sense, I think, in some of the contemporary movements that see themselves as successors of the civil rights movement.
If you look at countries, my understanding is, for example, that Canada, or maybe Australia as well, don't really haven't had for some time anything like the state church. It's like Church of England. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Has religion held up better in those other English-speaking countries?
Well, certainly better than it has in Western Europe.
And
yeah.
What about the States compared to the States?
Less so in the States. I mean, I think, this, I haven't been following sort of the latest statistics as closely as I might have 5 or 10 years ago. So, I could be wrong about, what the trend lines look like. But, less robust than the United States, more robust than in Western Europe. I do think that, Madison's old wisdom about, religious pluralism being a good thing for religious vitality. I think that was an important and still largely correct insight.
I think of Voltaire's statement about how if you have one religion, it oppresses, one major religion, it oppresses everyone else. If you have 2 religions, you have a civil war. If you have 1,000 religions, people are free.
Yeah.
And do you think that works politically as well?
Right. Well, it does. Pluralism then does create another problem, which is this problem about how you maintain some degree of civic solidarity and civic trust when you have high levels of pluralism. I think that's the central problem that we're wrestling with right now in the United States through immigration and other kinds of cultural developments. Has become very culturally fragmented again. Much more so than it was when you and I were young. I think people who if you think back, well, why was that? I think there were a couple of reasons why things felt more solidaristic in sort of mid to late 20th century. And one was that there was a long period where there was much less immigration. Right? There was a period of of mass immigration, late 19th, early 20th century. That's when most of my ancestors came over. So, I'm not denouncing immigration or anything like that. I obviously benefited from that. but there was a period where there was lower immigration, then there was the Depression and the war, and those kind of crisis experiences did actually bring people together. We talk about the greatest generation, and the kind of sacrifices that they made, but I think that's also, that created a certain kind of basic trust and comedy also at the level of leadership, national leadership, which was very important. I mean, not to say that everything was perfect and golden in the 50s and 60s. I mean, if you were, say, a black woman living in the South, well, things probably weren't so good. But at least at the sort of level of our civic culture, I think there was overall greater solidarity, and I guess that's one of our big challenges, is how to recover more of that again.
Now, I do remember being a little Jewish kid in Brooklyn, growing up in a country that I and my parents regarded as Christian. I'm not quite sure one can confidently say that today, for a variety of reasons. If that's the case, if we're not Christian in the sense that we were in the 50s and before, what do you think that augurs for the country? What sort of challenges does that create for us?
Well, again, I think it's always been, this is not the first time that we've faced this kind of a struggle. So I think, again, if we think back to, the period of our youth, talking about the kind of ecumenicism, sort of Protestant, Catholic, Jew, and Will Herberg's famous phrase, right? I mean, that was actually a remarkable thing, that there was this kind of equality and comedy to some degree, even if Christians were numerically and culturally still the dominant force in the United States. And so I think that the challenge now is to, in particular, to think about how religious and secular Americans learn to sort of respect each other and work together and feel like they're they're part of a common project. I mean, I have thoughts about that. I mean, one thing that I think would do a great deal of good for the country is if we had a program of national service for young people, mandatory national service for a year or two. It would, in some ways, create that kind of socialization experience that a lot of people had during the Depression and the war, of working with people who from different parts of the country, who are seem very different from themselves, and being engaged in a kind of a common endeavor. And in some ways, I think that's more necessary now than ever, just because we're so siloed. I mean, it's not just race anymore. I mean, it's income and party and religion and lifestyle and on and on and on and on. I mean, we're so fragmented, and we just don't really interact on a daily basis, or we don't need to interact on a daily basis with people very different from ourselves, and we sometimes get a very strange picture of of what other people are like and what the country is like. And so I think that would, to have young people in a sort of formative period of their lives like that, do something like that. And also, I think just, build something, feel like they had contributed something to the common good and, the public good. That would be also a great thing.
So during the period of the founding, most of America's political leadership drew on a kind of philosophy of government that had a variety of roots. Some of it was a kind of Whig tradition that saw itself, I guess, in some degree as an inheritor of ancient republicanism and of kind of British political history. And some of it was a kind of Christian view, not only that there was a special providence guiding America in some way, but also that the rights that they felt they were kind of enshrining in the fabric of the Republic were God-given rights. So there was a kind of theological view that had fairly deep roots in not only in Protestant but even in Catholic Christianity. a great deal of political discourse nowadays, almost naturally, has to do with what kinds of rights people should have. Rights against government, rights against other people, whatever. If you no longer can invoke a kind of divine plan, where does that leave the philosophy of rights as a kind of bedrock position in American political discourse?
It's a good question. Maybe a little bit above my pay grade. I mean, I suppose if you're a political philosopher, then you you reach for some kind of a Kantian argument about human dignity or personal autonomy. Maybe if you're looking for a position that could appeal to both religious and non-religious people, you might reach for some kind of a personalism. Which personalist philosophy is something that has both kind of theological and kind of secular philosophical variants. So I don't think it's impossible. I mean, I guess again, what I worry about with our sort of contemporary rights culture is that if rights are really just something that's rooted in individual autonomy, it becomes very difficult to say what limitations on rights there should be and what duties should correspond to those rights. That I think is more the problem that we face. I think the idea of rights for most Americans is just so ingrained in our civic culture that most people don't really think terribly hard about where they come from, and that's probably okay. Not all of us are going to be, ponder those things. Not all of us need to.
Well,
all of us get paid to.
Well, I mean, there are kind of rival majoritarian views and
Sure.
utilitarian views that are kind of easy to evoke too,
Right.
And certainly have political constituencies. But our loss of that, I think, and I'm sure you'd agree, is a kind of significant, or if we haven't lost it, at least the attenuation of that
Right.
is a pretty significant development. If you look outside of the United States, at the rest of the world, there the secularization program does not seem to be proceeding in the same way that it is in the West. Why not? I mean, certainly in the rest of the world, if you take the Islamic world, for example, there's been, and I'm not just talking about jihadists here, there's been plenty of alliance between politics and theology. It's not as if they don't have official dogmas and state-enforced belief. But religion seems much more there. Let's take the Islamic world then as an example. Much more a vital force in mobilizing people, in shaping government policy, in defining collective and individual set of identity. Why do you think that's true there?
That's really one of the biggest and most interesting questions that confronts scholars of religion today, I think, Steve. I suppose the starting point for thinking about that, or one starting point for thinking about that, might be this magnum opus by the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, A Secular Age, which appeared a decade ago. I imagine you're familiar with the book. And here he really tries to sort of tell a kind of philosophical, cultural history that tries to figure out where what he calls an exclusively humanist understanding or worldview, why and when that first arose, and he sees that as something that's fairly distinctive to the West. It's very, as you probably know, it's a very long and intricate narrative, and I won't try to gloss it here. But it's interesting that he, in posing the problem that way, I mean, for him the problem is not to understand why religion persists. I mean, religion has been around for thousands of years. If you look outside of the West, as you say, Signs of its demise are few and far in between. Though the question is really more, well, where does a kind of exclusively humanist position come from? It seems to me that's perhaps a better starting point, and then to look for analogs to that development. I mean, you do find them. I mean, there certainly is a strand, for example, in Confucian thinking, which is secular is not quite the right word, but you know, it regards popular religion as kind of superstition, which is to be tolerated insofar as it's socially useful. I think that's probably still more or less the view of the current regime, actually. As long as it's not dangerous, as long as they don't get too organized or subversive, you know, we'll put up with it, especially if it makes people, you know, kind of law-abiding citizens and, you know, makes them work hard. I mean, you find this strands of this within Indian metaphysics too. But, you know, how that becomes something that's culturally dominant, or at least dominant within the cultural elite, that I think is that's a really profound and tough question that I wouldn't even begin to try to answer. But I think that's the way I would approach the question, instead of asking, why is religion still hanging around?
So, okay, religion is the default position, and if it ceases to be, that raises the question.
Yeah, that would be I would turn the tables in that way on proponents of the traditional secularization narrative.
Mm-hmm. So the whole notion that science has had some impact here is something that you kind of downplay. You don't think that science is. I mean, science is in some respects an alternative way of explaining how the universe works. And I think it's true of Judaism and Christianity, and to some extent Islam, though Islam does not borrow completely the scriptures of Judaism and Christianity. It draws upon them without borrowing them. That unlike Buddhism, certainly, and I think to some degree Hinduism's claims are so vastly cosmological, it would be difficult even in the present time to test them. But there were a variety of assertions made about how the world works in the Jewish narrative, which Christianity takes over. There's a story about creation. There's at least implication as to how the solar system is organized, and other things like that. Those are the main two, actually. From the period of Galileo through Darwin, you have, I think, what honestly would have to be called a kind of disconfirmation of those two things, at least if taken literally. And you know, you also have, given the power of science, an alternative epistemology for approaching things, which is rather critical about evidence and things of that kind. So one might think, at least, that since that also occurs in the West, that might have some connection to the decline of faith in the West. Christianity being the religion of the West, it's the one that takes it on the chin. But you're skeptical of that account, and why are you skeptical of that account?
So I don't want to pretend that that there's no tension between science and religion, because this would be one position. There's no tension. They just deal with completely different questions, and so you know, what's the difficulty here? But I also don't think that it's wrong to say that there are certain kinds of questions that religion attends to that are not really scientific questions, and that science is ill-equipped to answer. I mean, these are basic questions about kind of meaning, purpose of life, creation, the cosmos, and so on. Those are questions that science can't really answer for you. I mean, I suppose science can become for the scientists can answer that question. That becomes the meaning of your life. But for non-scientists, it doesn't really tell you where we come from, how we should live in some ultimate fashion. I mean, it provides a narrative, right, that certainly challenges a certain, as you say, a literalist reading of Scripture. But we can even argue about whether that literalist reading is itself not something that's kind of modern, that arises in response to science. I think if you look at the more sophisticated forms of theology within the history of Christianity and Judaism, I mean, they're not literal in that way. They have much more complex and multi-vocal ways of reading text.
Well, you might say I'm trying to be the devil's advocate here, but to take another problem that might give you a hypothesis. If you have a faith community, that means it's a community that is taking certain doctrines on a basis that's different from the way in which one comes to believe things in the everyday world. You're not requiring that you see and hear and touch, and you're believing in things that, if they were reported to you in other contexts, would seem very improbable, but nonetheless you're believing them. Say you have that kind of belief, but it's in a society where many other people have similar types of belief, but different in all their details, or many of their details. And they're living side by side. And they have occasion to kind of exchange views. They know what isn't that going to have an effect, wouldn't you think? I don't know how you test the hypothesis, but isn't that going to have some effect on certainly more doctrinally anchored faith-based positions?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is a characteristic experience of our secular age. This is the way that Taylor characterizes it, is that ours is not so much an age of disbelief as an age of optionality and pluralism, and what he calls mutual fragilization, in which we're constantly interacting with people whose beliefs differ from ours, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in large ways, and this creates a sort of a sense of fragility about our own convictions and commitments. I think that is how it feels to live in the current age, and that in some cases might lead to disbelief. Of course, I mean, disbelief is one of the options that's out there, and it's one that feels very attractive. It might even be, in some ways, the default option in our culture now.
There's a saying by Chesterton that when people cease to believe in God, it's not that they come to believe in nothing, it's that they now can believe in almost anything. Well, I mean...
there's a lot of truth to that. So, I mean, if you look at, if you kind of dig a little bit deeper into these surveys that get done in Europe and North America about people's beliefs, people may say they don't believe in God, but they might believe in reincarnation, and they might believe in astrology, and they might believe in UFOs, and they might believe in ESP, and they might believe in it. So, as you say, the idea that you move from a position of literal, kind of traditional religion to scientific materialism. I mean, that's one option, but that's not the one that most people choose, in fact.
Well, say you move to dialectical materialism. I mean, do you think there's a relationship between the organization of religious doctrine and the organization of some of the secular creeds we have today, in the sense that they appeal to the same kinds of human needs?
Sure, I mean, they can potentially, though I think a lot of secular ideologies, they're not really sort of a complete package for how to live your life in the way that traditional religious creeds are, and I think that is the source of the authority of a lot of those creeds is not so much. It's not exclusively divine revelation. It's also collective experience that many people have lived according to this creed, and this has generated a certain kind of stability, well-being, flourishing, individual and collective, and that's part of the reason. I mean, there is in essence a kind of a certain conservatism there. It's almost kind of there's a sort of a Burkean argument, if you like, from embracing a religious tradition.
Though, of course, there have been millennial religions within not only the Western tradition but elsewhere that have been antinomian, that have told people, you know,
Right.
you can cast off all these encumbrances. I mean, to some degree, I mean, some people, I think it's wrong, but some people, you know, interpreted Jesus' message in that way as well. You know, the law is no longer there. So, in that sense, kind of secular utopianism is much like that kind of millennial religious view that people have held in the past. Is there much among sociologists who kind of work in religion? Is there much conversation with sociologists whose field is sort of more generally ideology? I mean, is it considered a subset of that or something different?
Oh, I suppose to the degree that gets studied nowadays, it's studied under the heading of sociology of culture or cultural sociology.
I mean, ideology is
Yeah,
studied.
that's how that would actually get studied. You know, ideology is one of these words, I guess, has gone out of fashion for the moment. Maybe it will come back.
What has replaced it?
Culture.
Culture.
It sounds less critical and more non-committal and more neutral.
The
right?
Bolsheviks were about culture.
Yeah. Well, the word does still get invoked in some context, but it's, you know, you really don't hear it as much. I mean, maybe in sort of public discussion, but in the seminar room,
Really?
I just don't hear the word ideology that much anymore.
Is this kind of a post-Cold War phenomenon?
I mean, I still remember hearing it when I was in graduate school. I think it's different things, but I think a lot of it is just the kind of quest to sound neutral.
They don't read Edward Shills and people like that?
Not as much as they used to, yeah. Yeah.
What do you think is the future for the scholarly study of religion as a sociologist? Do you have students who you have sent on their way?
Sure. Well, I think you know, as in many other fields, I think one of the things that's happened is that there is much more attention to non-Western cultures and the interaction between Western and non-Western cultures. So you would have been a pretty rare bird 30 or 40 years ago if you learned Arabic and studied Islam, or you learned Chinese and you went and studied you know, Chinese Pentecostals in the hinterlands of Western China. That's not so unusual anymore. And that, I suppose, also just has to do with the kind of increasing flows of students you know, around the world and through American universities in particular. So it has become more transnational. That's the proper term that we now use.
So Christianity, though in decline, it would seem, in the West, is spreading in other places.
Yeah.
I assume that's being studied as well. What is it that makes large parts of East Asia, Korea, for example, where I think Christians are now something like 30% of the population, sort of many places in Africa, and of course you have the spread of evangelical Protestantism in Latin America too. What can we glean from examining those phenomena about the nature of religious conviction and about the future of religion and Christianity particularly?
Well, part of this is of course, you know, the historical legacy of Christian missionary movements from the late 19th or early 20th century. So that's part of what's going on. But I think it's also the movement of people and things and ideas around the world. I mean, if you decide that you're interested in Taoism, just sit down at your computer, right? And you'll have translations of all the texts, and you'll have videos by various adepts, and you'll be able to find out where there are, you know, meetings. You know, Asheville, North Carolina, as it turns out, is a major center. I know this from a friend. predictably also parts of Northern California or another major center, including Berkeley. So that's part of it. I think if you're thinking about China and Africa, I think part of what's going on there is that the religions, the sort of indigenous religions, if you like, were ones oftentimes that were very tangled up with locality, lineage, custom in a particular place. So if you go to a Chinese village, right, the kind of festivals there, the temples, people still, of course, come back, even the people who've left and are working in one of the major coastal cities. But those are forms of religiosity that don't really move or travel very well, and are not really able to sort of bring strangers together. And that's one of the things which is distinctive about Christianity, also Islam. They were, from the get-go, they were missionary religions. They were religions that arose in the interstices of large heterogeneous empires. They were really formed in urban contexts. I mean, you can see there are all these reasons why the sort of voluntaristic, kind of more creedal, universalistic characteristic of Christianity and Islam. And this is, of course, also true of Judaism during the period in which Christianity arises, right? That people don't think of it this way, but Judaism was a religion that won many converts during this period. That spread very rapidly through the Roman Empire. In some ways, that was the seedbed out of which Christianity arose, and why it had the kind of appeal that it, broad spread appeal that it did. So without that seedbed having already been formed, I don't think Christianity would have become as successful as it. So anyway, this is just all to say that there are ways in which these are religions that are just better suited to the kind of lives a lot of people are living now during this period of mass urbanization, mass migration, rapid dislocation. So I think that's part of the reason why they spread to these other parts of the world and become so successful there.
So, as a sociologist of religion, if you were somehow miraculously transported 100 years into the future, you still think you'd have a lot to study?
Yeah, I'm very confident of that. I'm very confident of that. Although, if you ask me what things will look like, I'm not going to make any predictions. Those usually don't turn out so well. But I do feel fairly confident in saying that religion is not going to disappear. It's going to change, I'm sure, but it's not going to disappear.
Well, I think you're right, and thank you very much for sharing this with us.
Thank you, Steve.